Well, it is good to be with you today. Today is the third week of a 3-week sermon series called Honest to God, when you're just not feeling it. And so what we've done in this series is we looked at 3 Old Testament characters when they're not feeling it and help them understand for those of us who feel like that. So a couple weeks ago, we looked at Jeremiah, who helps those of us who feel like burned out Barry, that we're just kind of tired or weary. Last week, we looked at Moses, who helps those of us who feel like unhealthy Ursula, that maybe we're not good enough or we've done some things that make us not want to wholeheartedly follow Jesus. And today we're going to look at Jonah, who helped those of us who feel like self-focused Sergio. Now, I got to give you a little disclaimer. The first 2 weeks, those two, God was very compassionate and loving and kind. When we're a little self-focused, sometimes God kind of hits us on the side of the head with a 2x4. That's what he did for Jonah in a big fish. We're going to hear that later. And I think God might want to do that with us today. So that's your warning. I actually needed this a number of years ago. I remember it. It was 17 years ago. The reason I remember it, it was just after my third child was born. Here's a picture of my family from 17 years ago, back when I thought goatees and shell necklaces were cool. And we look like such a great, happy family, right? That little chubby kid in the front is going to turn 17 in 2 weeks. That's why I know how long ago it was. And we look like a great, happy family there, but the reality was rather different. The truth is, right after we had 3 kids, I felt completely overwhelmed. I mean, there were just kids everywhere, snot everywhere. You can't go to the bathroom by yourself. I mean, I was just a little bit overwhelmed. And so I remember that somehow, I don't remember how it came up, but at some point during this stage, my wife decided to talk about having another kid. Now, before we got married, we had conversations about how many kids we're supposed to have. I had said 2 kids sound good. She said 4 kids sound good. We had agreed upon 3 kids, okay? And now we had those 3 kids, and I was already overwhelmed. She mentioned having 4, and so I decided, it wasn't necessarily a conscious decision of the time, but I realized this is exactly what I did. This is just genius on my part. You're going to see why in just a second. I decided, okay, if she wants to have 4 kids, how about if I help out less with our 3 kids? And even when I'm home, I'm kind of grumpy. Then she's not going to want to have 4 kids. So what happened was our marriage deteriorated very quickly. And she came and she's like, Josh, what's the matter? I can see something's wrong. And I'm like, I need some time. I need some me time. I have no time to myself. She's like, okay, what do you need? I said, well, I like playing basketball or reading. She said, all right, how about Saturday morning? That looks like the one time. So I was able to go away on Saturday mornings. The problem is I came back and I was still just as grumpy. And I got hit on the side of the head with a 2x4 when my wife, dead serious, this is not a joke, she came to me and said, Josh, if you're going to continue to have this attitude, I think you need to move out. I'm going to leave that story right there for a moment, because that's where we find Jonah in this story. We find Jonah at a time where he was kind of self-focused, and because of that, his life was not going in the direction he thought. I'll come back to the story in a minute, but let's now look at Jonah's story, because Jonah gives us some great insight into what we do when we're a little self-focused and not feeling it. The book of Jonah starts with actually God calling Jonah to go prophesy in Nineveh. Okay, now Nineveh was actually an enemy country, and there was also very wicked, and God says, hey, you need to go there and tell them all the bad things they're doing. It would be kind of similar if God came to you and said, hey, you need to go to North Korea and tell the people in North Korea all the stuff they're doing wrong and that they need to repent. Now, Jonah did exactly what we would expect to do. Jonah hopped on a boat and went in the exact opposite direction. Right? God said, go to Nineveh. He's like, no way. In fact, I found a map that helps, because I thought this map illustrates great what happened. So Jonah lived in Joppa, and God said, hey, go about 500 miles to Nineveh. Still a long ways. He hopped on a boat and said, no, I'm going all the way 2,500 miles in a different direction to go to Tarshish. I am not going to Nineveh, is what Jonah said. He was not feeling it. Right? He was not doing what God wanted. Now, what happens next is where kind of Jonah is famous for. all right? He's on this boat. A big storm comes up. And so the other kind of sailors on this boat confront Jonah, and they confront him. And I find it interesting what he actually says. They're like, hey, where are you from? Who are you? And one of the things he says to them, he says, hey, I worship the Lord. What's interesting about that is what we're talking about in this series is those of us who know in our head, hey, I know in my head that following God is the best thing to do, but I just don't feel like it. That was Jonah. Jonah admitted, hey, I follow God. He admitted it to the other sailors, but he also knew that he didn't feel like it. He wasn't doing what God had asked him to do. So ultimately, these sailors, they throw him overboard, and he gets swallowed up by this giant fish. We're going to look at what happens in that fish in just a minute. And then he actually gets spit out, and finally he does actually go and preach to Nineveh. He actually goes to this really dangerous place and tell them that they're doing things wrong. What's interesting is when he does that, Nineveh actually repents. God has compassion on Nineveh, does not punish them, and Jonah gets mad because of it. Now, I want to read this passage because this really helps you understand how Jonah was not feeling it. All right, Jonah, verse 4, verse 1 says this. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. What seemed wrong was that God chose not to punish Nineveh like God had said he was going to because they're wicked. Jonah prayed, I knew you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. But the Lord replied, is it right for you to be angry? It is, he said, and I'm so angry, I wish I were dead. Now, I understand this is a very serious moment for Jonah, but in my view, the way God is kind of looking at this is like those of us when we have a little toddler who gets so mad because their beat-up toy kind of breaks a little bit, and we're like, man, this shouldn't be that big of a deal, little toddler. This is the way God kind of looked at this to Jonah, like Jonah, come on, this is a good thing, Jonah. They repented, and Jonah is still not feeling it. And the truth is, we get like that a lot. When things don't happen the way we want, right? It didn't happen the way Jonah wanted it to happen a certain way, and it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen the way we wanted. God didn't do what we wanted, and as a result of that, we get angry. That's where Jonah was. That's where some of us are today, where things are not going. When things don't go the way we want, we get upset. Now, the great part is, while Jonah is inside the fish, he has this amazing epiphany. It actually changes him from running away to going to Nineveh. And this passage is so powerful in helping us, those of us who feel like a self-focused Sergio, helping us understand what to do. So let's read Jonah's prayer in Jonah chapter 2, verse 1. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God, and he said, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. These verses just give us incredible insight into what to do when we're not feeling it. Maybe we're a little self-focused. It starts off by Jonah saying, hey, in my distress, I called out. Jonah was honest, and we need to be honest to God. That's the first thing. We need to be honest to God about what's going on. Now, I will admit, many times when we are in this self-focused state, we like to blame other people. It's this person at work's fault. It's my boss's fault. It's my spouse's fault. It's my kid's fault. It's my family's fault. When we're self-focused, we often like to blame other people. And ultimately, we need to be honest to God and look at what is going on inside us. Now, the next thing that we learn from this passage is just, this is the key, all right? If you understand this verse 8, Jonah says, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. Those who cling to worthless idols. Basically, what Jonah is saying here is that selfish idols keep us from God's love. Following these idols keep us from God's love. Now, oftentimes when we think of idols, we think of like a primitive time where people were like, oh, they made statues out of gold and they worship these things. Often we think, well, I'm way better than those people because, I don't think an actual little statue is going to help my life. And so we don't pray to statues, very many of us anymore. Now, what I will say is we actually maybe have more idols than ever. but our idols look like things that we would accept. They look a lot more like this. Right? They're things that we think, boy, if I just had more of these things, then my life would be better. And following these things kind of crowds out our ability to follow God. So I think is really helpful for us this morning is to delve into what are these idols? And how do they impact our life? How do they, like this verse says, how do they crowd out our ability to accept God's love? So let's look at what an idol is. Here's a definition. An idol is anything in our lives that becomes more important than wholeheartedly following Jesus. Anything in our lives that becomes more important than wholeheartedly following Jesus. Tim Keller, who's a pastor, and he wrote a book called Counterfeit Gods, has just a great description. He said, an idol is anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything that you seek to give you what only God can give you. That's an idol. An idol. Now, a lot of times idols aren't necessarily bad things in themselves. They can be a good thing, but when they're out of proportion, where they become more important for God, then it kind of messes up our lives, allows us not to receive God's love, so we can't share it to other people. I did some research into what people think are the most common idols in America right now for Christians, and here's what the list came up with. The first was safety and comfort. I know many Christians who making sure they're safe and they're comfortable is the most important thing. The problem is, it is impossible to wholeheartedly follow Jesus and have safety and comfort as one of your top priorities. God almost always calls us to step outside of our comfort, do things that we're maybe not comfortable doing, step into situations that may be physically dangerous or may be dangerous to our reputation or just make us not feel good. God frequently calls us to do that. So if we're going to be wholehearted, we cannot seek safety and comfort as one of our primary goals. Success in career. Now, it's great to work hard and have a good job. It's a very good thing to do, but often our devotion to our work and our job can also, again, become more important than our devotion to God. Happiness. People say, I just want to be happy. Now, most of the time what they mean by happy is doing some of these things that we think of as idols, and so they chase after those and ultimately don't get to where they want to go. Same with leisure, entertainment, money, and material things. We think, man, if I just could have a little more leisure, if I just had a little more time to myself, if I just had this thing, then finally my life would be good. And instead actually crowds out our ability to follow God. Image and appearance. Maybe we're obsessed with how we look in person or maybe our online image. Family and children. I know people, even myself, can get so focused on my kids' success that I can put that as more important than God. And pleasure and sex. These are a lot of the things that can crowd out our ability. These are our current idols. Now, I'm going to ask you to do something, you don't have to say it out loud, but I'm going to ask you 3 questions that help us identify our idols. I need you to be honest with these questions. All right, these 3 questions are, what do you daydream about? What activities do you prioritize, and where do you spend your money? Now, if you want, I'd encourage you, actually, go ahead and take a picture of the screen, because it would be really helpful if you discuss this with some people close to you. Because these questions give an insight into your soul. The first one is, what do you daydream about? I know we got a lot of things we got to think about, work and family and all these things that crowd our mind, but there are times when you sit there and your mind wanders. And when your mind wanders, it gives a little picture into what your heart is thinking. And so does your mind wander to going on vacation? Does your mind wander to escaping to that beach? Does your mind wander to having a successful promotion at work? Does your mind wander to your kids being successful? Do you fantasize about sex? Do you fixate on losing weight or being better looking or having more social media followers? Where does your mind wander? Does your mind ever wander to how you and your sphere of influence could grow spiritually? Does your mind wander when you were at that Memorial Day barbecue last week? Did your mind wander to, man, I wonder how this group of people I'm with could love God more and serve God more? Does your mind ever wander to, how can I share God to my friends at work? How can I serve God more in these areas? If your mind never wanders into those areas, it's probably because it's being crowded out. by these idols. These things that aren't necessarily bad, but when they're our primary focus, it crowds out our ability to actually dream about what God wants for this world. What do you daydream about? The second question asks, what activities do you prioritize? One of my pet peeves, and I try not to do this, you're gonna probably tell me I did this to you and I'm sorry, is to say to someone, oh, I'm sorry, I would love to, but I just don't have time. The truth is, you have time to do whatever you prioritize. It's just a matter of whether that's a priority. If you don't believe me, just think of this scenario. Let's imagine that someone comes to you and says, hey, can you help me move? I gotta pack up my house, I need to move. Can you help me move at 2 o'clock on Saturday? You're gonna start to come up with reasons why you can't. Okay. And maybe you have a legitimate reason. You have something on your calendar that says, I can't. So you look at my calendar, I can't be there at 2 o'clock. Now imagine that same person came to you and said, hey, I have $100,000 to give away, and you have to be at my house at 2 o'clock on Saturday to get that $100,000. All of a sudden, your priorities change really rapidly. And all of a sudden, well, I can be there. The truth is, we do have time to do what we prioritize. The question is, what are we prioritizing? Take a look at your life. What activities are you prioritizing? And finally, where did you spend your money? Now, people have often said, hey, show me your calendar and your credit card and I'll show you your God. What are the things that you are choosing to spend money on? Are a lot of them things that just focus on yourself, or do you actually give a percentage of your money that helps those outside of you, that are giving it away to help those that God may want to help? Now, you may be asking me, Josh, are you trying to make me feel guilty? And the answer is yes. Because I think most of us who are living in the American church, we need to feel guilty, because often where we spend our time and money, where we dream about, our priorities are in the wrong places. Now, I will say, I was actually getting a little discouraged when I'm writing my sermon, I'm getting discouraged. I literally was sitting at a coffee shop writing my sermon, and I got a text message. And the text message was from someone who attends Black Rock Church and is leading a community group. And the text message was, hey, Josh, is the church doing that all-service day that we used to do? We used to, a few years ago, do something called Love Works Day. We had hundreds of people out serving. It was a great thing. And I had to text them back and say, hey, we don't have the capacity to do that right now, but it'd be great if your community group could serve, because they were asking that. They were like, hey, I want to do it. And they texted me and said, okay, I'll make sure our community does. And if there's any other community groups that want to help, let me know. What was so encouraging to me was, this is a guy who was at work, right? He was at work and his mind was daydreaming about how his community group could serve God and serve their neighbors even more. And so I texted him back and I said, hey, can I use this as a sermon illustration? And he said, yes, but make sure you tell people I was on my lunch break when I texted you. I'm like, you were still daydreaming about serving God when you were at work. Now, where are we daydreaming about? What do the selfish idols keep us from following God? Now, the reason that God is so committed to this, the reason that God wants to hit us on the side of the head with a 2x4 is because what it says in this verse, Jonah says, hey, the reason these idols are such a big deal is because they take away our ability to accept God's love. That's why we feel more stressed and anxious, because we don't fully believe that God is with us. That's why all these things are going on, because our ability to accept God's love gets crowded out. And so what do you do? How do we handle this? Well, I'd love for you to be more than just feel guilty, but also feel motivated. And so what I think we actually need is what I'm going to call an idolatry management plan. That sounds kind of like corporate or something, but here's why. Because ultimately, idolatry is like a chronic illness. It's something we're always going to deal with. We have a sinful nature. That doesn't mean we're not going to get victories in some areas, and some idols won't be as big a deal at some points in my life as others. But we're always going to struggle with things trying to crowd out our ability to follow God. That's the state of our existence. It's like having a chronic illness. I have one of my kids actually has a chronic illness called Crohn's disease. It's an autoimmune disorder. There's no cure for it. Now, thankfully, for my kid, When they have a management plan, they go get an infusion every week, they control their diet, they have a lifestyle. When they do that, it becomes a minor inconvenience, not the major problem it can be. And I think it's helpful for us to think about idolatry as a chronic problem because, one, that gives us some freedom to know it's always going to be there. Sometimes we get discouraged, like, oh, Josh, it's always going to be there. That is true. It's always going to be there, but we can manage it. We can keep it in its rightful place, not taking more importance than God. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, you have to help identify them. Like going through that questions really does help identify them. The other thing we need to do is look to God. Notice what Jonah said here. He said, with shouts of grateful praise, I will sacrifice to you. So it starts with those shouts of grateful praise that Jonah actually goes to God, remembering who God is, remembering what God has done. We need to worship God. That helps put our lives in perspective. And then he says we need to sacrifice. Oftentimes, for those of us who are a little self-focused, we actually need to step out and do something that puts us out of our comfort zone, to go do something that maybe does make us feel uncomfortable. I don't know if it's a mission trip. Maybe it's volunteering in kids ministry like they announced. Go do that. Help out with kids. Their snot can be on you. Whatever it is for you, maybe it's being intentional about talking to your neighbor or coworker about God in a way that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. That often helps. And finally, we need to surround ourselves with support. I mentioned I'd get back to my story. So 17 years ago, I was not in a good place. My wife had hit me on the side of the head with a 2x4 by rightly saying, Josh, if you're going to have this attitude, I don't think you should live here. And so we knew we needed to do something. So we did a few things. We looked into getting counseling. We also decided, hey, we're going to read a marriage book, but we didn't feel like it. And so we're going to invite 3 couples to come to our house one night a week to read this marriage book with us, because we knew we weren't going to do it on our own. So we needed them to come and force us to do it. So we did. And I will say that what happened is God ultimately changed my heart. And I realized how self-focused I was. In fact, I began to realize that, hey, isn't the whole point of Christianity that Jesus sacrificed himself for me so that it's my job to sacrifice myself for other people? I mean, we say it all the time, but it hadn't really sunk into me. I kept on thinking about, no, I need this, and I need that, and I need this time to do this, and I need this to do that. But realized it was like, no, I need to realize that Jesus sacrificed for me, and so it's my job to sacrifice for everybody, not just my family, but my entire existence should be about sacrificing to other people. And I don't do it near as well as I should. Like, there were multiple times when I had to tell myself, okay, Jesus died for my sins so I can play Candyland with my kids. I mean, I had to remind myself of stuff like that because I might not have felt like it, but that's the reality. In fact, look at how this verse ends. This verse ends with Jonah saying, salvation comes from the Lord. Ultimately, we need to stop being self-focused so that we can become God-focused. And when we start focusing on who God is, and this amazing sacrifice that Jesus did for us, then we are able to receive God's love and share that with other people. Now, the good news is I didn't have to move out. Ultimately, we had 2 more kids. We now have 5 kids. I don't know how that happened. And like everyone, we've had our ups and downs, but in a couple weeks, we are going to celebrate 24 years of being married, so that's pretty good. But I've come back to this many, many times, understanding who God is.
Thank you for watching Black Rock Church's Sunday service. We're so glad you found us, and we hope this message made you feel more connected to God. In talking about connection, we find that it's super important for people to be connected to others and to community in order to grow in their faith. So if you're in the area, we invite you to join us to worship in a service. You can find out about our times and locations right here on this webpage. We'd also love to help you connect in a group and find people who can walk alongside you as you continue deepening your understanding and faith. And after you get to know us, you might even like to use your gifts to serve on a team. We believe God gave each of us unique gifts that we can use to serve those around us. One body with many different parts. If you're not able to be here in person, don't worry. We have a great online community and many ways for you to join in virtually and talk to us throughout the week. You can also stay in touch on our website, YouTube channel, Facebook, and Instagram. By visiting our website, you can also easily give your offering one time as an online gift or a recurring gift. Just click Give at the top. The Bible tells us that tithing is an important part of our relationship with Jesus, and we want to continue to trust God with our lives and our finances. Well, we are so glad you made the choice to get to know us and view one of our services. We hope that you join us next week. Thanks so much for watching.